Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 31st. And as you know, the last class we reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I also had you do introductions. And if you've got any questions or concerns at all about the syllabus, the course outline, or the class as a whole, please contact me. And what I wanted to do today was to give an introduction to the idea of literature. And then we can actually begin reading pieces of literature. But you can think of today's class as a kind of introductory class. And before I begin, I had reviewed the syllabus but did not talk about the plagiarism section. So I just wanted to address that. And plagiarism, as I'm sure you have heard in other classes, is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So it's comparable to theft, but rather than property theft, it's intellectual theft. And it's a pretty serious offense. So if you were to be caught plagiarizing and you were to get off easy, so to speak, you would fail that assignment. But if you were not to get off easy, so to speak, then you could actually be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you were expelled because you plagiarized. And I always give a couple of stories to try to encourage my students not to plagiarize. The first happened to me very early on in my career. So this would be pre-internet days. And that meant that I couldn't go to the internet to verify where this person's writing had originally come from. And as many sources as exist to help students plagiarize, equal number of sources probably exist to help teachers determine if students are plagiarizing. One of my favorites is called turnitin.com, where I can type in a sentence or a paragraph and then I can do an electronic search. But again, I didn't have those resources, but it didn't take me long to figure out where I had seen this piece of writing before, because it was actually from the college textbook that I had assigned for our class, as if I wouldn't notice, with a few mechanical errors, whether it was because the person was sloppy with their plagiarizing or whether it was because this person was hopeful that if there were a few mechanical errors peppered in there, then I wouldn't become suspicious. But nevertheless, that's not really the most I guess persuasive story. My more persuasive story happened at around the same time period. So this is pre-internet, but did not happen to me. But it was in all of the academic newspapers. So there is such a thing as academic newspapers. And this is a story of a middle-aged professor. That part is important. And he's reading a set of papers and realizes that one of the papers sounds familiar. Again, not that unusual because we're pretty well read as teachers. And he's thinking to himself, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? And then it occurs to him he hadn't read it. He had written it as an undergraduate student a couple decades earlier when he was a college student. And I know the chances 1 in a million, but it did actually happen. It had something to do with the fraternity that was recycling papers, and basically somehow, some way, this student actually got a hold of his own professor's work from when this professor himself was an undergraduate. And I use both of those stories to try to encourage people not to plagiarize. But in the last several, I guess, weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks or so, as you've probably heard, artificial intelligence has sort of exploded on the landscape. And that means that there is also an explosion of resources to help individuals determine if artificial intelligence has been used. So I say all of this to basically caution you against plagiarizing. I kind of liken it to cheating on your taxes. It's easy to do, it's tempting to do, but if you get caught, you are in a whole bunch of trouble. So I encourage you to not do any of these suggested plagiaristic acts that I've examined with you or others, and instead, rather than focus on artificial intelligence, which is not real, to focus on real intelligence, which is what we are pursuing in this particular class. So, with that said, as I indicated, I had scheduled a set of readings just to lay a kind of foundation for the semester. Unfortunately, these readings are not available, or I have not been able to find them available for free online. Luckily, when we get to the actual pieces of literature, though, I have been able to find them for free online. So I will be providing those links as the semester progresses and we reach those particular elements. But today's first reading was about reading imaginative literature on pages 1 through 7. So this is a text that you can find in the GCC Library on Reserve if you need to access it. And also, I'm aware it's the beginning of the semester. People are adding and dropping. So you can certainly go back after the fact and review these pages. And a couple of the points that I really wanted to emphasize from this, and you'll see that I've reiterated this in the notes below, that literature does not lend itself to a single tidy definition. There are lots of different ways that we could go about defining literature. I suppose in the broadest sense of the word, it's any written text. That said, usually we mean text that is involved with some kind of storytelling. So I could certainly go into a store and ask for a piece of literature about their, let's say, refrigerator, if I were buying appliances. But that said, what I'm really looking for is an instruction manual or the specs for the product. And once I've read that, I probably don't need to reread it, because if I reread it, I really wouldn't get any additional depth or meaning from it. That's not the kind of literature that we talk about when we talk about literature that we would study in an academic classroom. We're talking about literature that is trying to, in one way or another, give a different perspective on the world through storytelling. Now, that said, there's probably an element of entertainment, or at least an attempt to entertain. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. And there's probably an element of trying to generate profit. And there's nothing wrong with trying to generate profit. But a piece of literature that's worth our time of academic study is probably doing more than just trying to entertain, and is probably doing more than just trying to generate profit. It's trying to make some sort of a social statement. If you talk to some of the great artists, they'll tell you that certainly they want to generate profit, but regardless if they were able to or not, they would continue to produce their work because they have a need to express themselves. And that's usually what we're talking about when we're talking about literature, those works that scholars and critics think are worth academic study. And in fact, there's a term for that. It's called canon. Those works that scholars and critics think are worth academic study. Now, this can be a little bit problematic too, because who are these scholars and who are these critics? And usually they're university teachers and professors. And the distinction between a university and a college is that usually professors at a college focus on teaching, and they might do scholarship on a secondary level. But at a university is the exact opposite, that you do scholarship on your primary level, you might do teaching secondarily. And these are usually university professors who have a good amount of academic training and made evaluations in terms of quality. So hopefully this is something that broadens our perspective. Hopefully this is something that provides social commentary. Hopefully, this is something that uses language in interesting ways. And there are some basics that are considered part of the canon, usually some names and texts that you expect. Shakespeare is usually one of them, because basically we've been taught generation after generation that Shakespeare is a great author. We don't even necessarily know why. And some of the people who were taught this become scholars and critics themselves, and they continue to teach that. So oftentimes what you see in the canon or with literature is that it has stood the test of time. But saying all of that, there are some problems that can be involved with scholars and critics because they can be very subjective and they can be biased, particularly in the past when scholars and critics basically were one demographic group, and that was usually Caucasian male. And starting around the 1960s or so, as student populations became much more diverse, and students began asking about the canon and how did the canon reflect their own experiences in terms of gender, or in terms of ethnicity, or in terms of sexual orientation, or if nothing else, in terms of time period. Why was everything that they were reading from basically the past? And there's even an old joke that the canon is made up of dead white males. So the canon began to be expanded to include voices that had just as much quality, but perhaps had not been selected by those scholars and critics. But this also is somewhat problematic because then either you increase the reading load by doubling it with all of the classics, plus you're adding in all these new voices and perspectives that have never been added in before, or you start cutting back on the classics in order to accommodate some of the newer works. Or you just keep the classics, and that means you don't accommodate any of those newer works. So usually what happens is that there's an attempt to make a balance. So there's a little bit of the classic canon and then some more contemporary voices, which is what you would be seeing in this particular class. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, in addition to the reasons why we read literature, because in a academic setting, you want to be a well-rounded individual and you want to have a background in many different subjects. And also because reading some of the great writers can help you improve your own writing. And also, you develop critical and analytic thinking skills when you are interpreting great pieces of literature or writing. There is an article, and you'll see in the notes below in section 2 that I have a link for, that talks about your brain on fiction, where they talk about what happens to our brains when we are actually reading. What they did is they did MRI scanning to try to get a sense of the changes that would occur when we are actually reading a text. And I'll just review parts of this with you. That one of the things that they found that was so fascinating was that reading, at least if these studies are correct, helps us to simulate reality. Researchers have known that classical language regions in the brain are involved in how brains interpret written words. And what scientists have come to realize is that these narratives, these stories, activate other parts of our brain as well, which suggests why the experience of reading can feel so alive. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of reading something and you actually forget that you're reading. It's a wonderful feeling. Words like lavender and cinnamon and soap elicit a response not just from the language processing areas of the brain, which we would expect, but also to those parts of the brain that are devoted to scent, because these words are associated with scent. So it talks about multiple studies across the globe. So I think that's one of the valid things about this particular article, is that it isn't just focused on one particular culture. This study was from Spain. Participants were reading words with strong odor associations along with neutral words while their brains were being scanned by MRIs. And of course, because the participants were from Spain, the words were in Spanish. When subjects looked at Spanish words for words like perfume or coffee, for instance, words that are very much associated with the scent, the primary olfactory cortex lit up, or the area of our brain associated with processing scents. When those same participants saw words such as chair and key, then the area of the brain associated with scent didn't light up. It was also similar with metaphors, comparisons of two dissimilar things, and figures of speech. So saying something like, you've had a rough day. A rough day, we say so many times, we don't even think about the context of the tactile sensation of rough in that when we think about this as a difficult day. But researchers, this was from Emory University, when they studied subjects in their laboratory and those subjects read metaphors involving texture, the sensory cortex responsible for perceiving texture through touch became active. So expressions like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands roused the sensory cortex, while other expressions that didn't have any kind of associations with touch, such as the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands or any other kind of tactile sensation, did not activate that area of the brain. Same thing happened in terms of describing motion. Another study from France, the brains of participants were scanned when they read very simple sentences, such as John grasped the object or Pablo kicked the ball. The scans revealed activity in the motor cortex, which is where the body's movements are coordinated. Even more, the activity was concentrated in in one part of the motor cortex when the movement described was arm related. Another part when the movement concerned the leg. So the particular area of the brain associated with that particular body part was activated. What could this mean? The brain, it seems, does not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life because the same neurological regions are stimulated. And in fact, it's been proposed that reading produces a vivid simulation of reality, one that runs on the minds of readers, just like computer simulations run on computers. Fiction, with all of its details, its metaphors, its descriptions of people and their actions, offers an especially rich replica. And perhaps novels even go beyond simulating reality to give readers an experience that's truly unavailable off the page, the opportunity to fully enter into other people's thoughts and feelings. This is probably the closest you're going to get through reading, understanding someone else's perspective. Certainly someone can tell you their perspective, and certainly you can try to determine someone's perspective, but you really don't know what somebody else is thinking or what somebody else is feeling. Even if they tell you, that might not necessarily be the truth or an accurate assessment. Sometimes we ourselves even struggle with what we are feeling. But through reading, we should be able to get into somebody's inner thoughts, which means, of course, this allows us to have lots of different experiences with people we normally wouldn't interact with, and also to have lots of different experiences that we would never have in real life. But we could read about it, and while certainly it isn't going to feel as if we were actually experiencing it, it seems that the brain responds in the same way, whether we were actually experiencing skydiving or reading about skydiving. Though certainly there is a different sensation that we feel when we read about skydiving as opposed to actually jumping out of a plane. But the brain, it seems like, would respond in the same way, at least based on the way these studies suggest. The novel explores human and social emotional life in a way that perhaps no other art does. And just like the brain responds to depictions of scent and texture and movements like they were the real thing, so too the novel treats the interactions among fictional characters as something like real life social encounters. And of course, in terms of this particular article, I use it as an example for us about all of the benefits of reading literature, and that it's more than just critical thinking, and we use critical a lot, critical thinking, critical analyzing, critical writing, not necessarily in terms of criticism, but asking questions, analyzing and interpreting. Doing what toddlers do very well. I've said this many times. They ask questions, a lot of questions. When we turn into adults, we tend to stop asking questions. And the number one question for toddlers is why. And I've oftentimes said that's the distinction between high school and college. High school is about learning what? College is about trying to determine why. And sometimes the answers aren't so easy. but that in addition to all of the skills that you can get from reading literature, perhaps the most relevant skill is your ability to interact with others and understand yourself better. So, as we move on from reading imaginative literature, and there was an interesting point in that reading from a book that is part of the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worth literary study, Moby Dick, and by Herman Melville. And I can say, as the textbook had talked about, Moby Dick was not initially viewed as a piece of literature. It was viewed as a study of whales, a study of cetology. And it was only years later, when it was revisited, that those scholars and critics thought that it was a piece of literature, that it was more than just about a whale, that the whale represented something, signified something. My own definition of literature is about rereading. Can you reread something multiple times and have it bring forth new meaning? And that's the distinction, I think, between the instruction manual for the kitchen appliance. Once you read it and you understand what it says, you don't need to reread it. As opposed to a piece of literature. Take Shakespeare, for instance, that's been reread for centuries, and there's still new meaning and new interpretation that comes out of it. So what I wanted to also talk about were critical strategies for reading, that basically reading literature and interpreting it became an academic discipline and also became a profession, much like law and medicine are professions. And like law and medicine, there was terminology that was developed for it, and you've also got generalists and specialists. So I just wanted to very briefly give you an overview of some of this. And we could spend an entire semester just talking about this. So understand that I'm oversimplifying. But it turned into a kind of profession about 100 years ago or so. And these individuals called themselves formalists, and they were looking at the formal elements of a work, things like the language, the structure, and the tone. Then, starting around the 1940s or so, going into the 1960s, there was a group of individuals who basically branched off and specialized. They called themselves the New Critics. Kind of a sad term, because once you say new critics, then what do you say afterwards? I'm the newer critic. But nevertheless, I don't think they were thinking about the future. Their focus was on a close reading of the text, that you didn't necessarily have to have a lot of background in language or structure or tone, that as long as you could read, at any point you could begin to analyze. A 7-year-old could analyze, and a 17-year-old could analyze, and a 27-year-old could analyze. But obviously, there would probably be a difference in the depth of sophistication of the analytic skills. But the New Critic said that you could read closely, and anything and everything that you could gather from that reading could be used in the interpretation. You didn't need to have any background knowledge. This was very attractive for school systems, because this meant that everybody could engage in literary analysis regardless of their academic background or their preparation. And then there were other specialists that branched off of that. Biographical critics, and luckily the terms help us determine what their focus would be. They focused on the biography, specifically the author's life, and that you couldn't really understand a text unless you understood the author's background. And that makes sense. But it also is somewhat limiting, because we may not necessarily have information about the author's background, or the information we have may not be valid. Also, there is that element of fiction. Just because an author is writing about something, that doesn't mean that there is a direct correlation to their life experience. Although, of course, one assumes that if it's a topic that the author wants to write about in one way or another, it's connected to their life experience, but there doesn't have to be a direct connection. So, as I like to say, you don't have to be a murderer to write about murder. Psychological critics focused on psychology, mental states, whether it's the psychology of the characters in the story, perhaps it's the psychology of the author and what prompted the author to write the story, or perhaps the reader, and how do our psychological issues or states influence us. If you're familiar with psychology, you probably know some of the great psychologists, such as Sigmund Freud, considered to be the father of psychology. So you could specialize even further and not only say you're a psychological critic, but you're a Freudian critic, and that means that you read everything through the lens of Freud's theories, which have been discredited over the years. Many of his theories involve sexuality. But nevertheless, the idea is that you're thinking about mental states, and that's the lens in which you read a piece. Historical critics looked at the history of the time, and that also makes sense, that you need to know the place and time in order to be able to interpret a work. And remember, the work was written for its time, not necessarily for our time. That's not to say we can't appreciate it in our time. But again, all of these presuppose that you've got a lot of background. So a historical critic in theory has had lots of schooling and time to research the history of the time period. And that means that you may not be prepared to truly analyze a piece of literature for quite a long time until you know all of the history. And again, history too can be misrepresented and can also be limiting, because literature really is about timeless and universal concerns. It's about the human condition. Yes, the plot might be somewhat different than we would expect in contemporary times, or the names or the fashions and the clothing that are described. But in the end, the universal emotions of love and fear and greed, that's something that should be universal and timeless. If you're studying economics, then you might be familiar with Karl Marx. Marxist critics focus on socioeconomics, and particularly they focus on capitalistic structures. New historic critics, and again the term is a little bit unfortunate because we have the historical critics, so the historicists that wanted to do something different called themselves the new historicist critics. But then what do you do afterwards? The newest historicist critics? But they looked at the culture of the time period. Basically, in the broadest sense of the word, culture is group membership. And through group membership, there's some element of a predictability, a predictive element associated with it. So you can get a sense of the behaviors, the attitudes, the beliefs, and the values of a particular group. That's not to say that there is an individual difference. And when we talk about the new historicist critics, and they were talking about cultural context, they were very much talking about popular culture, things like the music and the food and the clothing of the time period, what people valued, not necessarily just dates and political laws in place, which the historical critics would have been thinking about. And I think I mentioned to you that I teach a class in media and popular culture and also in horror films. So I'm very interested in the idea of culture and analyzing culture from an academic perspective, even though it may not necessarily have been created for academic interpretation. Gender critics focus just on that, gender. You can even specialize further. You could be a feminist critic focusing just on the female gender. You could focus on the masculine, on non-binary. So you can see that you can get very, very specialized. Mythological critics, they focus on mythology and say that these legendary traditional stories are told over and over again, just in different ways. I once had a professor in college who said there really are no new stories in literature. They're just retold differently. Reader response critics. This is a particularly interesting one because the focus is no longer on the author or the text. The focus is on the reader. The focus is on us as consumer. And that we as reader create meaning. Though this can be a little bit tricky, you don't want to necessarily suggest that the reader can say, well, this text means anything I want it to mean because I'm the reader and therefore I am correct. There has to be some evidence within the text in order to be able to support your position. But as long as there's evidence within the text so that your position is a possibility, then that position is valid. So the idea with a reader response critic is that you have a group of readers who basically have come to the conclusion that a text has a particular meaning. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be a meaning that the author says exists within the text itself. even though the author was creating or was the creator of the text. And I'll end, even though I could go on, with deconstructionist critics. They were very popular in the 80s and the 90s. If you know the word deconstruction, which means to take apart, this theory came from philosophy. You can see how many of these are interdisciplinary. And there was a French philosopher by the name of Jacques Derrida who basically came up with his theory of deconstruction in terms of philosophy, that life is filled with contradiction, and all of that contradiction means that, or all of that contradiction leads to our having to accept that there is no meaning and there is no true center to anything. It implodes, in effect, because of all of the paradox and the contradiction. And of a kind of nihilistic way of seeing the world, but it was transferred over to literature, and that all literature, at least according to this theory, has contradiction within it. And that contradiction acts almost like a positive and a negative number. They cancel each other out, so you end up with a zero. You end up with nothing. So some might say that this is a happy ending in a story. Others might say that this is a sad ending in the story. Happy and sad contradict one another, even though there's evidence to support both. Therefore, it's neither happy nor sad, and the story means nothing at all. It implodes. It deconstructs. Now, of course, if you know anything about the human condition, you know that we are contradictory and complex beings, and we have language to determine that. Something can be happy and sad at the same time. We even have a word for it, bittersweet. But if you're a deconstructionist, you wouldn't accept the idea that contradiction or paradox is part of life, that instead it helps to dismantle meaning. The theory was very, very popular until people began to realize that there was an inherent logical flaw within it. And it took a while for some of the great scholars and critics to figure this out, that the theory that says there is no meaning has meaning within it. The very theory itself saying there is no meaning is something that is purporting meaning. If you can wrap your head around that, it's almost like a tongue twister. Once people began realizing that, they became much less interested in deconstruction. Jacques Derrida said it merely proved his point that everything is contradictory, including his own statements. But again, he has fallen out of favor over time. So I just mentioned this not because I wanted you to choose a particular school of literary interpretation and say, well, I'm going to be a mythological critic, and everything I read, I will interpret from the lens of mythology. Let the reading determine for you how it is that you're going to read that particular piece. And, again, using the analogy of the generalist, let's say in medicine, as opposed to the specialist, let's say in medicine, we're in the general practitioner phase. And certainly specialists contribute a great amount, but sometimes they are so specifically focused on one area, they can't see the most obvious thing of all. So I encourage us to do the reading and then determine which way to interpret it. And there might be multiple lenses or ways that we can interpret a particular piece of literature. When we're reading literature, as I suggested earlier, you want to have multiple readings. I always suggest 3. That might not be feasible. I'm well aware of that. But the first would be for just plot, what's happening. The second, for analysis, trying to interpret. The third, shortly before you are going to discuss the reading, let's say in class, so that you can refresh your memory. But what you do want to do regardless is when you read carefully a piece of literature is that you want to have deliberate reading, not only with rereading, but annotating, taking notes, journaling. And in fact, we are going to be having journals in class. I'm making that a requirement. You won't have your first journal for a while, so we'll have some time to talk about journals. Even the questions at the ending of the text in our textbook can help direct your reading. And in this early set of readings that I gave you, they gave you an example of a story called The Story of an Hour. And we are going to be revisiting that next week because I wanted us to read The Story of an Hour as an independent unit and analyze and interpret that. If you're using the edition of the book that I had ordered for class, on page 17, there's an example of annotation about taking notes in the text. You might have noticed that in your textbooks, usually there's a lot of white space. There are large margins. That's done deliberately to give you a place to write notes. That actually increases the cost of the textbook because it increases the number of pages that the textbook would have. Not to say that you have to write in your book. You could certainly take notes on a computer. You could take notes on a pad of paper. There are lots of different ways you can do it. They also give you an example of a very detailed journal on page 20. And in my opinion, the example they give you is sort of in between a journal and a paper. Because I was telling you that a journal is an informal response that I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics. In fact, you could even just use bullet points if you so wanted to. I'm thinking about the kind of note-taking that you might be using when you are reading a piece. In fact, the kind of notes you might even write in your textbook. Now, what we see in their example is something that's much more developed. It's complete sentences and paragraphs. It's pretty polished. So in that way, it looks like a formal academic paper. But if you read the content, you'll see that it's not as formal as what we would expect in an academic paper. In that journal example they give us, it talks about how the journal author's father responded to a particular reading and how his grandmother responded to a particular reading, in addition to how he responded to a particular reading. Now, that would be great for an informal journal to start talking about how other people respond to a particular text. But that wouldn't be appropriate for a paper, a formal academic analysis where you've got to focus on one particular text. You wouldn't be talking about your family members' opinions. And if your family members wanted to share their opinions, they could register in the course and write their own papers. So I sort of see it as a kind of in-between ground. But I just wanted you to know that that was there, just to give you some samples, just to give you some models that you could consider. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as the semester progresses. Our next class, I wanted to talk about explorations and formulas, genres. That we talk about literature and that usually it's unique and it's creative. But sometimes it can be quite predictable. And usually that's considered literature that is not necessarily of as much quality as others, but as we will talk about next class, Shakespeare broke all the rules. He had texts that very much followed predictable formulas, yet they were also unique and creative. And we are going to read 2 stories, and you should have these read before our class on Thursday, because ideally, the readings that I have in the course outline should be read before you watch the class videos, so that you have a sense as to what it is I'm talking about. Though certainly you can rewatch the class videos afterwards. But what I'm going to talk about in Thursday's class video is about explorations and formulas. And then we get to start talking about some literature, some fiction, to read it and interpret it. And 2 short stories with very similar titles, but they are very different in terms of their content. One is called A Secret Sorrow. The other is called A Sorrowful Woman. One is considered to be a piece of literature that scholars and critics think is worthy of academic study. It's unique and creative and so forth. The other is considered to be formulaic, genre writing, that it's following a particular formula. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the distinction between the two. We'll also talk about writing about fiction. So at this point in the semester, we're just doing a good amount of reading. Once we've gotten through this Thursday class, then we can go into actually reading and interpreting short stories. So starting with next class with A Sorrowful Woman, this is where we have selections that we could pursue with a journal, which I'll talk about further. So what's left, I should say, for the class is our discussion forum question, which would be due on February 2nd, which is Thursday, by noon. And if you need an extension, please let me know. And certainly that will be the time by which your next video will be posted on the 2nd, which is Thursday by noon. Probably before that, but certainly by that point. So you can sort of think of us as meeting on Tuesdays and Thursdays at noon, if that helps you keep track of the class. I've talked a lot about different ways to define literature. The textbook does as well. So my question to you is, what do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study, and why? What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study, and why? Again, no right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses as well as my responses to their and your responses. And that'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will pick up next class talking about a secret sorrow and a sorrowful woman. Take care. Bye-bye.